I've been looking at the independent inquiry into child sexual exploitation in Telford, i.e. the report on the Telford Muslim rape gangs. And whilst I had some hope initially that it might be better than the recent reports into the rape gangs in Rotherham and Oldham, I don't think it is substantially improved. I think the PR effect is a lot better, and I don't think it's quite so dismally bad as the Oldham report, but I still think it is pretty poor, and I want to go through why. Now, the reason I thought it might be better is because the fellow conducting it, Tom Crowther QC, he looked like he's more astringent, intense, and a bit more ruthless about getting through to the truth of the issue. But I don't think that has happened. What I think he's very good at doing is saying we must at all costs avoid doing X, Y, and Z, and then doing X, Y, and Z himself. But I want to play a little bit as to why I thought he might have been good initially. So if I play you this clip.
The overwhelming theme of the evidence has been the appalling suffering of generations of children caused by the utter cruelty of those who committed child sexual exploitation. Victims and survivors repeatedly told the inquiry how, when they were children, adult men worked to gain their trust before ruthlessly betraying that trust, treating them as sexual objects or commodities. Countless children were sexually assaulted and raped. They were deliberately humiliated and degraded.
And he also went on to say you've got to be tough-minded in looking at the problem, and you shouldn't indulge in wishful thinking.
Neither reflexive denial, deflection of blame, or excessively optimistic statements would be a useful response.
Okay, you hear that? He's against denial, deflection of blame, and excessively optimistic statements. And yet I think his report goes on to indulge in all three vices. And those are the headings I want to look at his report under. Okay, first off, reflexive denial. Now this is the report, the independent inquiry, Telford Child Sexual Exploitation. They are chaired by Tom Crowther QC, Volume 1. Now this report is very long. It's about 1,200 pages long, or nearly 1,200 pages long. It's cut down and it's cut up into 4 sections because the file would be so big. Otherwise, the executive summary comes to about, I think, 135 pages. That's mainly what I've read. I haven't read the whole parts 2 and 3. I haven't read. I've read part 1. I've skim read. I've read the executive summary. I've skim read part 4. It's so big, so mainly I'm relying upon the executive summary, long though that is. Okay, so if I go down to paragraph 614, now this I think is reflexive denial. Now, as to the suggestion raised by witnesses that Telford child sexual exploitation issues are specifically centred around the Pakistani or South Asian community, it would, in my judgment, be wholly wrong and undoubtedly racist to equate membership of a particular racial group with propensity to commit child sexual exploitation. Now he says wholly wrong. Notice the intensifiers there. Wholly wrong and undoubtedly racist. Well, why? I haven't seen anywhere in his report that says why that would be wholly wrong or why it would be undoubtedly racist. I don't think he looks at it. Now, that, I think, is that is reflexive denial. If it's true that a particular religious or ethnic group is overwhelmingly involved in these offences, then that is not racist. It is telling the truth. If the truth is racist, tough. I don't think the truth can be racist in itself, or uttering the truth can't be racist, because if you're driven by the motive to seek out reality, to find out what the reality is, I think that is reflexive denial. So I go on. That said, on the papers disclosed by key stakeholders, it is an undeniable fact that a high proportion of those cases involve perpetrators that were described by victims/survivors and others as being Asian or often Pakistani. Yeah, I bet they call them Muslims as well, some of them. Incidentally, the word Muslim is noticeably absent from this report, except mainly when it's talking about measures that are put in place in order to help the Muslim community, to help people integrate, to help violent Muslim boys in schools to integrate better into their schools. Including measures to segregate school assemblies. In those circumstances, the word Muslim is used, but it's studiously avoided here. Whenever I see the word a race word like Pakistani here used, I think that is about deflection, because someone in authority can talk about race, but if I talk about race, my feet won't touch the ground, I go to jail. It's a way of taking the debate out of my hands and keeping it within their own terms. Now, the inquiry has itself also heard such accounts from victims/survivors. In considering the evidence, and in particular the disclosed material, I've been cautious not to infer too much from names which may indicate wider geographical background and indeed religious heritage, but are wholly unreliable indicators of national background and, in particular, religious belief. So it gives your geographical background and religious heritage, but not of your national. And it's a wholly unreliable indicator of a national background and religious belief. Well, again, that seems to me to be a willful refusal, a willful failure to understand how religion works. Religion feeds culture, culture feeds actions. Even bearing that in mind, however, the evidence plainly shows that the majority of child sexual exploitation suspects in Telford during my terms of reference were men of Southern Asian heritage, including all the men convicted in Chalice and Operations Delta and Epsilon. Again, I think that is reflexive denial. If someone is called Mohammed or Ahmed, it's a pretty good chance he is nominally a Muslim or from a Muslim heritage, and it's probably highly unlikely that you had a lot of Hindus or even Sikhs engaging in these offences. So I think he's engaging in the kind of vice that he decries in that video, the introductory video that he gave there that I played a few minutes ago. And then he continues in the next paragraph, 615. No perpetrator of child sexual exploitation has volunteered evidence to the inquiry. Well, of course, they're not going to come forward and say, yeah, I did this, I want to talk to the inquiry. They're going to stay well out of it. There is no evidence to assist me in determining why they committed acts of sexual exploitation. So what he's saying there is because no one who has done time for these crimes has come forward to talk to him. He has there is no evidence to assist him. That seems to me to be willful blindness. But I regard it as important to consider whether there were any circumstances which might have led perpetrators within the Asian community to feel that they could act as I consider they did, essentially with impunity. So what he's saying is they acted with impunity, they felt they could act with impunity, and he wants to see if there's any evidence, any circumstances which might have contributed to that. So you think, so maybe he's going to look at where the problem comes from. Look at the Muslims, although he seems to refuse to use the word Muslim. Don't know why. But when you go further down, what you see that, in fact, that is an excuse for him not to look at the perpetrators, but to look at the council. So the council created the conditions in which Muslim men felt that they could behave with impunity. And he comes down to those factors in the next paragraph. Basically, first there were significant events which caused tensions between West Mercia police and the wider community and concerns over race. Yeah, I'll come back to this later. He refers to them in chapter 9. Second, I heard evidence that during the 1990s, teachers and parents were reluctant to address potential child sexual exploitation issues for concerns that they would be labelled racist. And third, I heard evidence from a number of witnesses who suggested that certain areas of Wellington were not approachable by the police. So again, none of this looks at the authorities but not at the perpetrators. And this is a theme of this report. That what he does throughout is what he keeps saying is that people are scared of being labelled racist. People are frightened that someone else might call them racist. People fear the effect that that might have on their career. They fear the trouble of it. They don't want to be accused of racism. And that theme goes right through the report with a kind of a strange blindness to the people who are doing this. It's as if I have a couple of wasps' nests in my roof. If they start stinging me or people, I'm going to focus on the wasp nest because it's the wasps that are doing it. I'm not going to focus on the council or anyone else or myself or my neighbours. It's the wasps that are doing it. And similarly, here, it would be nuts for me to do anything else. And in the same way, with this report, not focusing on the people who are committing these crimes just seems very strange and willfully blind. And it goes throughout this report, right to the end, right to the conclusions. If I come to this part here, this is part 4 of the report, conclusions, paragraph 9.99. During the course of the inquiry's work, I have tried to gain balanced evidence and I have tried to seek views of the Asian community in relation to these issues concerning race and racial tensions in particular. No, that's irrelevant. You're there to find out why they did it. I have met representatives of the Interfaith Council in Telford. Well, if you've ever been to an interfaith event, you'll know that the one thing they're about is whitewashing Islam. Everything else is window dressing. Who supported the inquiry in disseminating our calls for evidence to all members of the Interfaith Council who in turn were asked to share the inquiry's advert calling for evidence to their congregations and communities. So, you get evidence from the Interfaith Council, whose members then go to their congregations and say, have you got any evidence about child rape gangs? But there has been a very limited response from, there has been a very limited response. While I draw no adverse inferences in relation to this, it is important that I make that clear, as it does mean that I may have heard one side of the story. So what he's saying is Muslims have been invited to engage with his inquiry. They've been invited to give evidence, and he has had a very limited response. And so he's not going to draw any adverse inferences. He's entitled to draw adverse inferences. Why is he not? This is an invitation to Muslims never to engage, never to respond to an inquiry like this. Because if you steer clear of it and you don't say anything, then the inquiry will simply refuse to draw any adverse inferences. And it will also say, well, I'm hobbled because I've only heard one side of the story and that might be unfair to you. That again, I think, is reflexive denial. What he should be saying is, I have tried to reach out to the Muslim population. I've gone to their self-appointed community leaders and said, look, you are tarred with this brush. You've got to come forward and give us evidence. Otherwise, it's all going to go against you. In civil proceedings, if there's a claim against you and you don't turn up, you get a default judgment entered against you. In criminal proceedings, if there's a charge against you, you don't turn up at court, you get arrested, stuck in the slammer, and then you're dragged up to the court to answer the charges then. Here he seems to be saying, don't engage, that's fine, there's nothing bad to say, I draw no adverse inference against you. How are you going to get Muslims to respond to any future inquiry if they read this? Okay, so that's reflexive denial. The next heading, the next thing that he said should be avoided is deflection of blame. And I think he does this by focusing on the issue of race, talking in terms of race, talking in terms of Pakistani people, they undoubtedly legally are a race, or South Asian people who legally I think would qualify as a race, and I think he takes as being a race, and by saying that racism is a terrible thing, and studiously avoiding throughout using the word Muslim. The word Muslim, I've done a search, it appears very, very seldom throughout this report. That seems to me to be a telltale of the wish to avoid talking about religion and the religious influence and the religious population who are guilty of these crimes. And you can see evidence of this when he goes through in more detail the factors that he thinks might have caused people to fear being labelled as racist, and why there were race problems within the borough. So let me go back here. If I go to this paragraph, I think it's 9.72. Okay, no perpetrator, this is among the conclusions, no perpetrator of child sexual exploitation has volunteered evidence to the inquiry. There is no evidence to assist me in determining why they committed acts of sexual exploitation. That seems peculiarly naive. I can't get over that. But I regard it as important to consider whether there were any circumstances which may have led perpetrators within the Asian community to feel that they could act as I consider they did, essentially with impunity. Okay, that's the same wording as before. Now, what he does is he then goes down, he says, in order to analyse fully the role of race and racial tensions, he talks about racial tensions influencing the council to hold back and not enforce against Muslim rape gangs effectively. He doesn't put it in those terms. And what he looks at is 4 deaths of what I think were non-Muslim black men. So a fellow called Ian Gordon, he was shot dead by West Mercia police. That was in 1991. Then in 1999, Errol McGowan, his death was thought to have been a suicide. Maybe there were turf wars going on. And then in 2000, Jason McGowan, the nephew of Errol McGowan, he was found dead in similar circumstances. And the inquest recorded an open verdict that was seen to have been possibly a result of racial tensions in the area. And then you had John Elliott, a black man, and I think his death was linked to drug dealers. Okay, so these are black men, non-Muslim, but that creates supposedly racial tensions, which then cause the council to back off, and then Muslim men believe that they can act with impunity. Now, if the reasoning of this report writer was correct, that was the cause, then that would have meant that non-Muslim black men, or particularly non-Muslim black men, like the non-Muslim black men who died in these, whose deaths are talked about in these paragraphs, it would have caused them to engage very much more in this kind of offending. But no, it's almost entirely Muslim men doing it. It would also have caused Sikh and Hindu men to do it, and very few of them appear to have done so. It's almost entirely Muslim men. Why them in particular, he doesn't say. I think this is about deflection of blame, saying it's not about the perpetrators, it's about the council standing back and letting the perpetrators get on with it. Now, he gives an example of this when he talks about taxi drivers. Now, if I go back to here, bear with me just a moment. Paragraph 257, so if I do that, paragraph 257. In May 2006, concerns were raised by drivers about what they saw as heavy-handed enforcement by the council. A complaint including allegations of racism led to a cabinet member expressing their view that licensing enforcement should cease pending an independent investigation. So effectively, a taxi driver, I wouldn't mind betting a Muslim taxi driver has said, the reason you're not giving me my taxi license is because you are racist. And then I'll go to the conclusion of what this report says on that point. Okay, paragraph 275. In my view, the 2006 decision to suspend licensing enforcement was a disastrous one. On the material I've seen, it was born entirely out of fear of accusations of racism. It was craven. Now, this is a point that he repeatedly makes, that there are fears of accusations of racism, and this is what caused the council to behave, not to enforce effectively, and therefore these crimes happened, almost as if the perpetrators, they had no agency. They were simply allowed to get on with it by the council, and therefore they did, and they're not to blame. The council are to blame. And perhaps I'm suggesting that being a taxi driver makes you unsafe around children, turns you into a child rapist. That's the sort of the implication of what he's saying here. He is standing back from focusing on the perpetrators, and you cannot get a grip on this problem without a really hard, aggressive, tough-minded focus, a really quite ruthless focus on the perpetrators, and that is not happening here. Again, and I think that is deflection of blame. It is not taxi drivers. It is not the council doing this. It is the Muslim population very largely doing this. It is the perpetrators doing this. And that is what needs to be got a grip on. And the third vice that this report writer said we should not engage in is in excessively optimistic statements. Now, I think the recommendations are, if not in themselves excessively optimistic statements, they are based upon excessive optimism. I just want to go to those now. If I go, bear with me. Now, these are the recommendations, all 47 of them, and again, they don't focus on the perpetrators, they focus on the council. And what it reads to me like is a list of things that the council can do in order to prevent themselves being accused of anything if, as I think is unavoidable, this line of offending continues. So pursuing my wasp nest analogy and use the word wasps or wasp nest instead of child sexual exploitation. Establishment of a joint WASP review group. And then number 2, joint WASP review group to publish an annual WASP report. West Mercia Police to prepare mapping and prevalence data to be shared with the joint WASP review group. Number 4, council to prepare CATE, that's a sort of a reporting support group, data to be shared with joint WASP review group. Schools and colleges to prepare data to be shared with joint WASP review group, etc., etc. Information sharing, training to be implemented in order to clarify responsibilities around confidentiality, information sharing and safeguarding. Ring fencing CATE team resources, ring fencing West Mercia Police's CE team resources, etc., etc. There is nothing there. The closest these 47 recommendations get to is where they talk about taxi monitoring. And if I can find it, yes, licensing council to review its WASP complaints procedure. That's the kind of silliness. I'm being facetious here, but it's to make a point that none of these recommendations go to the heart of the problem, which is the perpetrators. That seems so obvious to me, it's not worth saying, but it's not happening. The closest it gets to the perpetrators is by talking about licensing information sharing with neighbouring authorities, taxi driver training. So, I mean, Muslims must laugh at this. They must say, we commit these crimes, our men commit these crimes, and then we get taxi driver training in return. It's a doddle. Or the council to review and improve its complaints process for public complaints or concerns in relation to licensing and or taxi drivers. Okay, even if this works perfectly and it is 100% effective, the most it will do is to reduce the use of taxis, of on-the-clock taxis for this kind of offending. And then it also talks about takeaway licensing as well. Well, I mean, that's going to have very little effect. It might get, what it will have the effect of is making Muslims a bit more careful, doing it a little bit more on the down low, keeping it quiet, not being quite so brazen about it. And that is a feature that has been going on for more than a decade. The authorities coming in, trying to run PR for Muslim populations, in part by telling them to be a little bit more careful, to try to be a bit more discreet about it, and then the Muslims throwing it back in the authorities' faces. As I think is likely to happen here, to the extent that any Muslim takes notice of this report. And again, as regards overly optimistic statements, I want to go to read to give you 2 quotes from this report that I've already dealt with, because I think they're so telling. If I go back to this, where are we? There. To be clear, I have seen no evidence from which I can conclude that West Mercia Police was institutionally corrupt or that individual officers were corrupt, but I do accept that certain incidents, for example failing to police certain areas and allowing parking in police stations, have led to a suspicion among the public of corrupt behaviour. On the evidence I have seen, however, I have seen no evidence to suggest that such incidences of preferential treatment or inaction continue today. So, what he's saying is people have come forward with allegations of preferential treatment and corruption, and he said, there have been instances of preferential treatment and inaction, not corruption, preferential treatment and inaction, and he's saying he's seen no evidence that it continues today. Full stop. I don't see him inquiring any further about that. I think that is an overly optimistic, an excessively optimistic statement. And again, when he talks about the very limited response from the Asian community, let me just go back to that one. Again, I think this is telling. I have met representatives of the Interfaith Council in Telford who supported the inquiry in disseminating our calls for evidence to all members of the Interfaith Council, who were in turn asked to share the inquiry advert calling for evidence to their congregations and communities. But there has been a very limited response. While I draw no adverse inferences in relation to this, I think that is an excessively optimistic statement. It is important to make that clear, as it does mean that I have heard one side of the story. So I think this report is indulges in the vices that he warned against in his introductory video, namely reflexive denial, deflection of blame, and excessively optimistic statements. And the effect of it, I'm not saying this is what he intended, but I think the effect will be the effect of a lot of politicians' statements over the last 10 or 12 years. And I think the first place to look at those, there's a good example of that in the statement from Jack Straw, which I think kicked off a lot of initial interest in this atrocious line of offending, when he talked about Muslim or Asian men seeing white girls as easy meat. If I go to this story here, the story here, Jack Straw, that's in, the date is January 2011, and Straw called on the British Pakistani community to be more open about the issue. These young men are in Western society. In any event, they act like any other young men. No, they don't. It's overwhelmingly Muslim men who are committing these appalling crimes. Other men don't seem to rape girls with underage girls with broken bottles, 12, 13-year-old girls with broken bottles or baseball bat handles. They don't nail their tongues to the table. This is what Muslim rape gangs do. But nevertheless, they act like any other young men. They're fizzing and popping with testosterone. They want some outlet for that. But Pakistani heritage girls are off limits, and they are expected to marry a Pakistani girl from Pakistan, typically, he said. So they then seek other avenues, and they see these young women, white girls who are vulnerable, some of them in care, who they think are easy meat. I think this reads to me as Jack Straw running PR for British Muslims, saying, come on, be a bit more discreet about this. You're embarrassing us. Keep it on the down low. Don't be quite so brazen about it. And of course it got thrown back in his face. He was decried as a racist. And a month later, Jack Straw regrets easy meat wording. And he said he admitted he regrets his choice of words when he said some Pakistani men saw white girls as easy meat. But he said he was sorry for the offence people felt he had caused. Okay, so he's backpedaling there, even though it says he refused to apologise for his remarks. Oh, all right. Now, another example of politicians running PR is in 2013. In 2013, Oxford was briefly the epicentre of the Muslim rape gangs. And the government strongly encouraged, this was Damien Green, he was the policing minister, Damien Green. He appears to have strongly encouraged Muslims to read out a prepared statement condemning child sex grooming. And this is nothing but PR. Simply getting an imam to read out a statement, that is pure PR. I don't know what possible effect that is going to have on this the appalling crimes that these rape gangs commit. And that was thrown back in his face. You would think what a lot of Muslim leaders said is this is already part of Islamic doctrine, so we don't have to say it, therefore we're not going to. A little bit like a vicar saying, I'm not going to tell my congregation to love their enemies because that's already part of Christian doctrine, so I shouldn't have to say it, and I won't. That's the BBC report. There's a local Oxford Mail report, this report here, National Sermon on Child Grooming, shunned as a stunt by many Muslims in Oxford. What you have is, I think, 3 of the main mosques in Oxford, which was at that time seen as the epicenter of this crime, and the reason why this sermon was circulated amongst mosques throughout the UK, 3 of them, the main ones in Oxford, refusing to do it. So Together Against Grooming, TAG, said 500 mosques across the country were taking part in sermons to address the issue at Friday prayers. But those who attended the Medina Mosque in Stanley Road, the Bath Street Mosque and Oxford Central Mosque in Mansell Way said they did not take part. Again, Imam Monawar Hussain, the Oxford Foundation Youth Project, went to Friday prayers at the Central Oxford Mosque in Mansell Way and said the Imam of the mosque spoke about Ramadan and charity. He said the tag sermons were a publicity stunt and fed into the far-right agenda that grooming gangs stemmed from the Islamic culture. He said most of the guys who did this in Oxford were not going to the mosque. I have always felt it is not a race or religious issue. They were talking to the converted, every single Muslim. Yeah, that's what happens in church or in a mosque. You talk to the converted. Who else are you going to talk to? Every single Muslim knows it is abhorrent. So because every Muslim knows it is abhorrent, it shouldn't be said, it shouldn't be preached as part of a sermon in a mosque. Okay, I think this is the government trying to encourage, trying to run PR for Muslims and it being rejected by the aforesaid Muslims. And the next example is this about Anne Cryer. She's always talked about in pretty glowing terms as being a brave lady who spoke out against the rape gangs early on. Rotherham report reduced me to tears, says MP who exposed abuse a decade ago. And look at this story here and think about what this means. In Keighley, she tried to get the Pakistani community on side, after learning that the News of the World had offered the 7 mothers of Muslim rape gang victims, £1,000 to tell their story. I thought if this happens, knowing the way the News of the World would handle it, it would cause chaos and ruin any sort of race relations that we had. We could have race riots, the works. I think that is running PR for the Muslims. That's another attempt of a senior politician to run PR for Muslims. So she asked a friend, a Muslim counsellor of Pakistani heritage, to approach the elders at the mosque with a list of 35 names and addresses of the alleged perpetrators. He said to the imams, Anne Cryer would like you to go around to these families and explain that this behaviour is totally un-Islamic. But the upshot was that the elders allegedly said, go back to Anne Cryer and tell her it's nothing to do with us. So it is a fool's errand running PR for Muslims. They will throw it back in your face. They don't want it. They will reject it. Don't do it. I think that will be the effect of this latest, not the intention, but the effect of this latest report in Telford. But don't take my word for it. Judge for yourselves. You can read all 1,200 pages of the report. It's got a nice long executive summary, 130 odd pages long, and tell me what you think. So what can you do, and how will this get solved? Well, there are really two things you can do. The first thing, which I would like people to do, because I think it would be good for self-respect, would be for us to embarrass the authorities by volunteers setting up our own kind of detective service to try and fight to do the necessary detective work which the authorities are failing to do. That would embarrass the authorities into doing it properly. I don't think anything else is going to work. Subjecting them to these kind of reports long after the damage has been done, long after the people involved have retired, I don't think that's going to work. Outrage porn on YouTube, getting people to bang the donate button, I don't think that is going to work. That's not going to have any effect. The politicians don't care about that. That will have zero effect. The only effect will be to say, look what we, unpaid detectives and unpaid service, can do that you won't. But to do that, I think you'd need a minimum of 10 to 20 people. You'd need very committed, skilled street workers or outreach workers who can engage in victims of these crimes, who can earn the trust of people who've been victims of these crimes. You'd need very skilled online data miners who can look for partially hidden but still publicly available information. You'd need detectives, sort of journalist detectives, people who are quite good at knocking on doors, gathering information that way. You'd also need lawyers, not just me, but a bunch of lawyers who can advise, because you would be operating at the edges of the law. If that were got together, then I think and you'd be able to, that would embarrass the current authorities and police authorities, and it would embarrass them so much that they'd probably put more effort into shutting down such an initiative than they put into trying to shut down the rape gangs. But that would embarrass them into doing something. I don't think they're going to get a grip on these rape gangs. But unfortunately, what I've described there, some kind of volunteer detective service, I think that's completely unrealistic. I don't think people are going to do it. I think people are just not motivated to do that much about it. And so I think the second option, which is simply to sit and wait for society to break down, I think that is the more realistic option. And I think that is what will work. The bottom line is that societies, highly statist, welfareized societies like ours, they just don't work. It is important to condemn their evil and immorality, but what is more immediately relevant is the fact that they don't work. And what doesn't work in economic terms falls over. It collapses. What can't go on forever doesn't. And I think we will see these our societies break down, and then I think we will have to. I think that the failure to root out and get a grip on these Muslim rape gangs the day before yesterday, that is a sign of the dysfunctional nature and the inability of our societies to function, to work. And so I think the societies will fall over. When they do, I think we will simply be forced to get up a form of society that does work. And I've been through, for what it's worth, I think that will be a form of private law without the state, where people club together in order to sign up to law, to impose law and order on themselves. And I think in those circumstances, people are going to be very tough, not to say ruthless, about the Muslims who are around them, not wanting them around them, wanting to make sure any of them are held to account at the very minimum. So that is how I think these the Muslim rape gangs are likely to be got a grip on. I don't think it's going to happen through one inquiry after another, and then one inquiry after another into the previous inquiry. And I think this latest report on the Telford rape gang scandal, I think that is another illustration of how these reports, these inquiries, are not going to work.